What if one marriage changed the map of the known world? Charlemagne, king of the Franks and builder of the first Western Empire since Rome's collapse, marrying Empress Irene, the formidable ruler of Byzantium. Not just crowns joining, but the Mediterranean itself bridged into a single channel of power, a Christian superstate looming over trade, religion, and diplomacy. In this alternate timeline, that union doesn't just reshuffle titles. It rewrites the balance of power between Christendom and Islam, reshapes Africa's trade routes, and sparks 3 possible futures. But before we test those outcomes, let's look at the marriage that never was. 2 rulers stood at the peak of their worlds, each holding pieces of a shattered legacy. In the West, Charlemagne, the Frankish king who had dragged a fractured patchwork of kingdoms into order. In the East, Empress Irene, who had clawed her way into sole power within the Byzantine court, balancing on the knife edge of politics and palace intrigue. Their marriage, had it happened, promised more than dynastic convenience. It held the chance to reunite what was once Rome into an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Levant. Yet, for all the potential, it remained unrealized. The question is why such an opportunity failed, and why it mattered so much in the first place. To see the stakes, you have to remember the world of the late 8th century. The Roman Empire that once tied the Mediterranean together was centuries gone, its western half splintered beyond repair. Germanic kingdoms filled the void, constantly clashing, until the Carolingians emerged with Charlemagne pulling them into something firmer. His reign was less about ruling one tribe and more about building a platform big enough to call itself an empire. He wasn't just another king, his ambition was openly Roman in scale. Meanwhile, Byzantium, the supposed heir of Rome, was fighting for survival on multiple fronts. Wars with the Abbasids drained resources while religious controversies like iconoclasm fractured society. Within the palace walls, every ruler lived under the shadow of plots, coups, or poison. Even when Byzantium held on, the empire was a battered version of its older self. Constantinople shone, but the provinces drifted or fell away. Irene's rule cut directly into this chaos. First a regent, then a sovereign in her own right, she marked a rare moment when a woman sat on the Byzantine throne with full authority. Capable yet ruthless, she restored icons to churches and projected stability abroad, but her grip on the court was tenuous. The brutal act of forcing her own son from power showed just how far she was willing to go to stay in control. For the Franks, though, she symbolized an opening, someone willing to break precedent and consider alliances outside the usual Byzantine elite circles. Charlemagne recognized the moment. By 800, he had secured dominance over Western Europe, and when the Pope crowned him emperor, it sent a deliberate message. Rome's legacy was not confined to the Bosporus. That crowning angered Byzantium, which still considered itself the true Rome. Here, marriage was more than a personal union. It was a political calculation. By joining with Irene, Charlemagne could secure recognition from the East, giving his title legitimacy to match his armies. For Irene, an alliance with the Franks offered protection from rivals and bolstered her fragile authority at home. But Byzantium was never just one person's will. The aristocracy and court bureaucracy despised the idea of a Western barbarian sitting next to their empress, no matter his crown. To them, Charlemagne was a foreigner meddling in affairs that were rightfully Roman. Even Irene, for all her audacity, could not bend her court to that degree. When a palace coup forced her out, the debate ended, her successors wasted no time scrapping any hint of union with the Franks. In the span of months, the possibility vanished. What makes the episode striking is how unusually aligned their needs actually were. Charlemagne wanted legitimacy and a partner in facing the Abbasids. Irene needed a reliable ally against rebellion and the constant specter of usurpation. For once, East and West faced enough common enemies that cooperation made sense. Had they closed the deal, the empire created could have rivaled the Abbasid Caliphate in both size and influence, controlling not only armies but the crucial crossroads of trade that reached from Europe into Africa and Asia. Even more, a union would have stopped the centuries-long argument over which Rome was the real Rome. Instead of splitting faith and politics into separate camps, a single throne could have anchored a united Christian authority. Imagine one banner flying above both Aachen and Constantinople, one empire controlling the seas and the land routes alike. In theory, it was the perfect synthesis of brute Frankish power and Byzantine statecraft. Of course, history didn't oblige. The court intrigue of Constantinople erased Irene's bargaining chip before anything serious could begin, and Charlemagne was left with a Western empire alone. Still, the scenario lingers. Because if that marriage had stuck, the Mediterranean would not just have looked different, it might have operated under a single order guiding trade, religion, art, and war. And that opens the door to the real question: if these two worlds had united, what kind of empire would they have built together? Let's start with the most optimistic outcome, Scenario 1, where this unified empire doesn't collapse under its own weight, but instead holds together as a peaceful Christian superstate. Think of it as the best-case version of Rome reborn, stable, prosperous, and focused on building rather than bickering. Religion would be the cornerstone of this unity. In our history, the East-West Schism split Christianity into rival camps, each pulling loyalties in different directions. But here, with Charlemagne and Irene at the helm, that divide may never emerge in the same destructive way. Instead of the Pope and the Patriarch competing, both would operate under a shared imperial framework. Disagreements over rituals or doctrine wouldn't vanish overnight, but the incentive to compromise would be far higher when both churches answer to the same authority. The result? A fragile but genuine religious cohesion, freeing the empire from the endless energy drain of internal quarrels. This religious alignment supports governance on a scale medieval Europe had never seen. Rather than letting the West's fractious feudal squabbles dominate politics, Charlemagne's model of local loyalty could be balanced by Byzantium's bureaucracy, which specialized in managing diverse peoples and provinces. Imagine a hybrid government that used the Byzantine talent for its administration and taxation to tame Frankish nobles while still giving them a degree of autonomy. The system wouldn't be perfect. Medieval lords were never easy to control. But with more tools at hand, disputes could be managed without constant bloodshed. What emerges is not chaos, but a functioning superstate stretched from Iberia to Anatolia. Economically, this empire would sit like a giant hub at the center of world trade. The Mediterranean becomes not a contested frontier, but an internal sea, secured on all sides. Merchants could travel from Alexandria to Marseille under the same laws and protections. Byzantine ports in the east would funnel goods arriving from Asia, which then move west through Frankish lands to the Atlantic. At the same time, African routes across the Sahara connect gold, salt, and ivory to this vast network. Instead of fractured corridors prone to raiding, the empire stabilizes every link in the chain. When trade moves freely, innovation accelerates, just as the circulation of silk, spices, and manuscripts enriches every society that touches them. Cultural exchange in this world becomes the empire's quiet superpower. Byzantium brings its art, mosaics, and philosophical traditions. Francia contributes its emerging architecture, military innovations, and renewed interest in scholarship. Instead of Europe waiting centuries for a renaissance, you get a cultural flowering early. Imagine stone fortresses influenced by Roman engineering, decorated with Byzantine iconography, standing in Aachen or Paris. Education, long patchy in the West, could spread more broadly if imperial policy followed Charlemagne's enthusiasm for learning and paired it with Byzantine institutions. In time, the empire might stitch together a common intellectual tradition, uniting Greek thought, Roman law, and Christian theology under a single banner. Strategically, their grip would be unmatched. Controlling both the western heartlands of Europe and the eastern Mediterranean meant near total dominance over sea trade and inland routes. That security alone would discourage opportunistic invasions. A single imperial stamp on coinage could carry weight on markets stretching from the Sahara to Persia, a medieval version of global currency backed not just by wealth, but by stability. Infrastructure projects, from roads to fortified harbors, would both secure territory and advertise imperial power. Relations with neighbors, particularly the Islamic world, could have taken an entirely different tone as well. Real history saw cycles of conflict between Christendom and the Abbasid Caliphate, punctuated by brief spells of uneasy coexistence. Here, a strong but unified Rome wouldn't necessarily need to fight. It could afford to negotiate from a position of confidence. That might mean sustained periods of trade across religious divides, with scholars traveling between Constantinople and Baghdad, merchants moving through North Africa without fear of raids, and gradual technological exchange that benefits both sides. Instead of building toward centuries of crusades, the empire might invest in cooperation, at least while it strengthens its own stability. Of course, this vision depends on restraint. Human ambition doesn't simply disappear, and medieval rulers were seldom content with compromise forever. Still, under this scenario, the empire avoids the worst pitfalls of division and manages to channel its strength into prosperity. It's a tempting alternate history, one vast, peaceful Rome presiding over the Mediterranean, shaping trade, faith, and culture for generations. But peace was never the only possibility. In a different version of events, the very same union might look far less like harmony and far more like a looming threat, one that pushes its neighbors into rivalry instead of cooperation. Scenario 2 takes a different shape, a world where the union of Charlemagne and Irene doesn't produce open battle, but instead sparks a long religious Cold War. Here, the Mediterranean becomes a stage not of constant wars, but of tense posturing, propaganda, and endless maneuvering for advantage. Peace feels fragile while rivalry saturates politics, trade, and innovation alike. For the Abbasid Caliphate, this unified Christian Rome presents a new kind of rival. The Caliphate is already stretched thin across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Central Asia. Suddenly, it faces an empire that matches it not only in sheer size, but also in theological ambition. From Baghdad's perspective, the new Christian order looks less like a neighbor, and more like a would-be crusader state looming on the horizon. To keep pace, the Abbasids would double down on scholarship, governance, and military strength. Their intellectual flowering, those vast libraries, translations of Greek philosophy, and advances in science, could take on a sharper edge, less about curiosity for its own sake, and more about arming themselves ideologically against a Christian superpower. Meanwhile, the Romans wouldn't just sit back. Byzantium was already masterful at defensive engineering, walls that could shrug off sieges, harbors protected by chains, and the infamous Greek fire at sea. Combine those traditions with the cavalry experience and raw force of Charlemagne's armies, and you get a superstate deliberately designed to be untouchable. They might not invade outright, but they would signal that they could if pushed. Stalemate becomes the norm, with both sides more concerned about showing strength than actually using it. But cold wars are never limited to soldiers and castles. Trade routes and economies would become battlefields of their own. Both empires depend enormously on commerce across the Mediterranean and into Africa. Suddenly, control of ports in Egypt, North Africa, or the Red Sea becomes as valuable as any fortress. Merchants and caravans become pawns in decisions far above their heads. An empire that dominates salt, gold, or spice routes doesn't just get rich, it controls the lifeline of its rival. That alone would keep both powers meddling far beyond their borders. Africa feels this pressure immediately. Take Aksum, the Christian kingdom straddling the Red Sea. In real history, it traded with both Muslim and Christian partners. In this alternate world, neutrality becomes far harder. Aligning with Rome might win it protection and prestige, but at the cost of angering Islamic markets it depends on. Staying neutral risks isolation. Aksum isn't destroyed by this Cold War, but its choices shape whether it thrives or becomes a pawn on the global chessboard. Further west, the Ghana Empire sits in a similar bind. Its fortunes grow from gold and salt routes, connecting sub-Saharan trade to Islamic states in North Africa. If Christian Rome extends its influence southward, Ghana faces new pressure. Do you lean toward the Christian superpower, or play both sides for maximum profit? Choosing wrong could choke off trade, but refusing to choose risks drawing unwanted attention. In either case, Ghana is no longer outside of geopolitics. It is embedded within it. What's ironic is that this tension might produce as many gains as losses. History shows that rivalries drive innovation, whether it's the Cold War space race or city-states competing during the Renaissance. In this alternate timeline, keeping one step ahead of the rival might speed up development in shipbuilding, agriculture, navigation, or architecture. Advances would spread across borders, even if indirectly. Both Rome and the Abbasids invest heavily in efficiency, not just to thrive, but to deny the other side any opening. Still, the downside remains enormous. Ideology becomes a weapon as much as armies do. Religious art and texts double as propaganda, pushing each side's claim to being the true chosen faith. Hostility grows not through bloodshed, but through generations of hardened suspicion. Over time, the space for genuine coexistence shrinks. Even if full-scale crusades never erupt, the world is defined by mistrust. That kind of long-term tension leaves scars just as deep as open fighting. So this second path offers a paradox. On one hand, rivalry stimulates culture, learning, and trade in ways that might even surpass our own timeline. On the other, it locks billions of lives into a permanent low boil of fear and division. For generations, both Christians and Muslims look over their shoulders, waiting for confrontation to change from whispers and rumors to something far darker. And if that tipping point finally comes, if restraint collapses, the fragile balance of this Cold War has only one possible outcome. Scenario 3 is the darkest fork in this alternate timeline, a full-scale Christian-Islamic war that engulfs the Mediterranean and beyond. Here, Charlemagne and Irene's unified empire channels its strength not into negotiation or balance, but into an aggressive push to reclaim lost Roman lands in the Levant, North Africa, and Spain. Instead of uneasy coexistence or simmering tension, you get centuries of open warfare, draining societies on both sides and leaving little room for recovery. The first step would almost certainly be the Levant. For a Christian Rome, holy cities and old imperial provinces carry symbolic weight far beyond practical gain. Seizing Jerusalem or Damascus would represent both divine approval and political dominance. But holding those cities is another matter. The Abbasid Caliphate would throw every resource it had into counteroffensives, forcing Rome into brutal, drawn-out sieges. Supply lines would be stretched to breaking, armies ground down in deserts and mountain passes, and any advance met by equally fierce retaliation. The Mediterranean itself would no longer connect the two worlds. It would become a contested front line, its ports fortified, and its trade routes strangled. North Africa would offer the same brutal logic. On paper, bringing old Roman provinces like Carthage back into the fold would look like a restoration of glory. In practice, it would be a quagmire. After centuries of Islamic rule, these cities were well defended, tied to wealth from African trade networks, and far harder to subdue than the Romans might expect. Every campaign would bleed resources that otherwise could have gone into rebuilding or innovating, and the damage wouldn't remain local. The disruption of North Africa's trade routes would ripple south into the Sahara and beyond, destabilizing kingdoms that relied on the steady flow of gold, salt, and goods. That puts African kingdoms in a precarious place. Ghana, sitting astride trans-Saharan trade, would see its prosperity endangered by two imperial giants vying for control. Align with the Abbasids and risk becoming a target for Rome's expansion southward. Lean toward Rome and lose access to Islamic markets that made the kingdom thrive. Even neutrality wouldn't be simple. Both superpowers might see Ghana's wealth as too tempting to ignore. Farther east, Axum faces the same trap. As a Christian kingdom, it might feel pressure to support Rome. As a trading partner of Arabia, it might have more to lose by provoking the caliphate. Neither path guarantees survival. The long-term costs of a Christian-Islamic war like this wouldn't just be measured in battles won or lost. Endless military campaigns would devour manpower, wealth, and time, turning societies inward and backward. History gave us a glimpse of this with the Crusades, which drained Europe for generations, but in this timeline the campaigns would be larger, broader, and constant. Scientific exchange would wither under mutual suspicion. Scholars who might copy manuscripts or share new methods end up conscripted or displaced. Libraries would burn not as a rare accident, but as a regular consequence of sieges. Trade in spices, silk, and knowledge collapses into blockades and piracy. Progress stalls, replaced by militarization. And, with both empires bleeding one another, outside powers would see their chance. Norse raiders, unchecked by Roman defenses spread thin across the Mediterranean, might carve deeper into the south than in our timeline, taking advantage of chaos and exhaustion. Later, the Mongols could sweep through Eurasia with even greater ease, carving territory from two civilizations too drained to resist. The very ambition that once promised hegemony instead clears the field for others. Inside the empire, fractures would open fast. A realm glued together by shared religion but stretched across continents isn't built to survive perpetual war. Provinces would chafe under conscription, taxation, and devastation. Local revolts, angry nobles, or governors unwilling to bleed their lands dry for distant campaigns could peel the empire apart from the inside. What begins as a confident restoration of Rome collapses into disunity, its scale and diversity turning from a source of power into a source of weakness. By the end of these centuries, you wouldn't find two titans staring each other down, but rather two burned-out shells. Rome weakened, the Abbasids shattered, cities reduced to rubble and trade lost to shifting sands. New challengers rise over their ruins, and the once stable Mediterranean, instead of being the heart of prosperity, becomes a graveyard of missed opportunity. The dream of unity ends not in triumph, but in exhaustion, leaving the world more fractured than before. And stepping back from this bleak path, the takeaway is hard to ignore. One alternate choice could have brought stability, another decades of rivalry, and yet another laid waste to whole continents. Which is what makes counterfactual history so revealing. The recognition that outcomes hang not on inevitability, but on fragile decisions and the consequences they unleash. So when we talk about alternate history, what we're really talking about is its long shadow, the way one unrealized choice keeps echoing across centuries of what might have been. The Charlemagne-Irene marriage is exactly that kind of moment. On the surface, it's just a proposal that never quite made it off the parchment. But widen your lens and you see how much weight rested on it, the balance of religion and empire. The survival of trade networks, even the shape of continents and cultures. This isn't a footnote. It's one of those turning points that makes you rethink how fragile the whole system really was. Start with East and West themselves. Historically, the Byzantine court considered itself the true continuation of Rome, while the Franks were dismissed as upstarts. The coronation of Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor created friction, but it was still more symbolic than authoritative. A marriage alliance would have closed that gap, anchoring Carolingian ambition with Byzantine legitimacy. One Rome, backed by claims both old and new. That flips Europe's internal story. Instead of two branches carved off the same stump, you get one trunk growing in a single direction. The implications aren't limited to borders on a map. They stretch into theology, politics, and culture. And then there's the question of the wider religious balance. The Islamic caliphates weren't just powerful militarily, they were also stable and culturally confident. For centuries they looked east and west and saw a fractured Christianity, rival churches, and rival thrones. Uniting Charlemagne's empire with Byzantium forces them to reckon with a Christian superpower that is both credible and centralized. Would this accelerate confrontation, or numb it by forcing both sides into a cautious stalemate? Either way, it turns the Mediterranean into a chessboard where every piece matters more, from Jerusalem to Cordoba to the Sahara. Africa reveals just how far the ripple could spread. Axum and Ghana weren't sideshows. They were essential to the pipelines of gold, salt, and trade goods that fed both Christian and Islamic markets. A Rome that dominates both Mediterranean trade and parts of Africa's economic arteries changes how those kingdoms function. Do they become clients, feeding wealth northward into an empire instead of balancing between rivals? Or do they thrive as middle partners in a long-term exchange system? The actual medieval story is one of constant adjustment and opportunity. In this alternate chain, the rules might tilt heavily toward dominance and dependence. The uncertainty is part of what makes the picture so haunting. Closer to Europe's center, it's easy to forget Charlemagne's own empire was hardly stable. It held together as long as his authority carried weight, not because the system was built to last. Byzantine governance, while more institutionally solid, was cut by endless palace intrigue. A fused empire would inherit both strengths and flaws, the bureaucracy to manage diverse populations, but also the knives-out politics that could paralyze it. Governing one continent-spanning state would demand compromises about language, law, even ritual practice that might not be sustainable, pushed too hard from Constantinople and the Franks bristle. Favor Aachen and the Byzantines revolt. The cracks would show fast, even under the glow of newfound unity. Religion deepens this tension. History gave us a great schism centuries later, born of doctrinal disputes and cultural divides. A successful union under Charlemagne and Irene could delay that fracture, but not erase its underlying causes. Greek versus Latin liturgy, centralized papal claims against Byzantine traditions, theological disputes that had been brewing for centuries. Unity at the top doesn't settle those arguments. It only postpones their eruption, and when they do erupt, they arrive amplified, fueled by the resources of a massive empire instead of divided spheres. Religion deepens this tension. History gave us a great schism centuries later, born of doctrinal disputes and cultural divides. A successful union under Charlemagne and Irene could delay that fracture, but not erase its underlying causes. Greek versus Latin liturgy, centralized papal claims against Byzantine traditions, theological disputes that had been brewing for centuries. Unity at the top doesn't settle those arguments. It only postpones their eruption, and when they do erupt, they arrive amplified, fueled by the resources of a massive empire instead of divided spheres. All of this circles back to the idea of path dependence. A single discarded alliance shapes not only dynasties, but the whole trajectory of continents. In world history, many events feel inevitable in hindsight. The Crusades, the East-West Schism, the Reformation. But none of them were locked into place. They were contingent, the outcomes of choices that didn't have to go the way they did. That's what the Charlemagne-Irene scenario makes plain. So when you play with these counterfactuals, you're not just imagining castles that never stood or crowns that never shone. You're staring at the mechanisms of history itself, the gears that turn when personalities collide with institutions and geography. The marriage that never was casts a shadow because it invites us to picture three very different futures: unity, rivalry, or destruction, and to recognize what was at stake in a moment most of us breeze past in a textbook footnote. That shadow isn't just about geopolitics. It's about how belief systems entrench or adapt. It's about whether trade becomes a bridge or a weapon. It's about the resilience or fragility of human institutions. A Rome that survived could have meant a Europe less fragmented, maybe less prone to centuries of warlord politics, or maybe it would have burned hotter and collapsed harder, leaving the world even more divided. We'll never know, but imagining the possibilities is what makes alternate history powerful. And that's the point. These missed chances and half-forgotten proposals shape not only what could have been, but how we understand what did happen. They remind us that history doesn't have neat arcs or built-in conclusions. It lurches, pivots, and sometimes stumbles. And in moments like the one between Charlemagne and Irene, you see how the smallest hinge can change the sweep of centuries. Which brings us back to the bigger questions still hanging in the air. Was a united Christian Rome more likely to be a bridge to peace, or the spark for an age of conflict? History never hands out simple results. It twists through close calls, missed chances, and choices that ripple outward. The idea of Charlemagne and Irene uniting East and West shows just how fragile the balance was. One decision could have changed religion, politics, even the flow of trade between continents. The weight of that almost is what makes this moment worth revisiting. And it isn't just about the past. Every age rests on turning points, decisions that seem small until you pull back and see their reach. That's why alternate history matters. It reminds you how much of our world depends on fragile hinges that could easily have swung another way.